making some of his speculations, and one wonders what he would have actually done if he had actually encountered some of this work. In his discussion of the coloniality of men's intimate lives, James noted that the coming West Indian novelist, and again, I'm back to that quote, will show the clash between the native temperament and environment and this doctrine from a sterner clime, anticipating so well the critique of coloniality for the future literary tradition of the Caribbean, but not the sites where its most daring contestations might emerge, which of course is Caribbean women's writing. James's unfinished journey never took him back to Caribbean women's experiences. However, for James, women are a future. And there's something about the sincerity of James's desire to rethink his past and the determination to move beyond the coloniality of gender relations, which still resonates today. And is it not a future from which contemporary Caribbean men still have a great deal to learn? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. I'm going to turn it over to Keith to make some remarks in response to Aaron's talk, and then we'll open it up to the floor. And then don't leave before you help yourself to some of the good things to eat outside the door. Thanks very much. Keith?
Well, thank you, Aaron. That was...
Should I stay
there was nothing about it before, so this is instantaneous response. I guess people who've never read anything by C.L.R. James will know very little about him. You know, how he came to be the leading intellectual of the 20th century Caribbean on the basis of his regional politics and his understanding of women. I mean, both were egregious failures. I mean, he made a complete botch of his insertion into Caribbean politics. It was humiliating. He took on his former pupil, Eric Williams, in Trinidad, and was defeated badly. And his relationship with women, I mean, he had in California, he courted her for a decade and wrote really, really brilliant letters. The collection of the letters by Anna Grimshaw called Special Delivery, taking place over a decade or more, are really remarkable. But there's no question that he thinks his best seductive technique is to offer himself as her mentor, which is, and then they get married and it goes bust within about a year or two. Then he gets thrown out of the United States, goes to London with Selma, who is half his age again, and they had a rather bitter relationship before splitting. So, at a personal level, James's relationship with women were dodgy, I would say. But as Aaron said, James did achieve a great deal. He wrote the first history of the Communist International in 1936. He wrote the first Caribbean novel published in Britain in the same year. He wrote his brilliant book, The Black Jacobins, on the Haitian Revolution, rescued that revolution from obscurity. He wrote with great prescience about the potential for African independence. He was a tremendous literary critic, a fine writer as well. And of course, a passionate and brilliant writer on sport. So there are, and finally, which will be my talk tomorrow, I believe he was one of the most, the deepest commentators on the history and practice of revolution in the modern period. So he had a lot to offer. I want to take up first Aaron's point about the newness of the Caribbean, conceived of in a political context. And I'll do it, if you like, anecdotally. In 1985-86, I was living in Cambridge, and I was invited to Cape Town, to UCT, for some academic gathering. And I approached my friends, my African friends, Ghanaians, Nigerians, Kenyans, in London, and said, well, what do you think? I mean, I thought there was a boycott. I mean, can I go? And they said, thank you. And they said, oh, no, Keith, you know, the boycott isn't for the likes of you. You know, you can go, it's fine. We wouldn't mind. So, yeah, I was a bit odd. But then I got an appointment in Jamaica, and for 2 years. And I arrived in Kingston, and shortly after was announced that I was thinking of going to Cape Town. And the Jamaicans went ballistic. I mean, they said, you must be out of your fucking skull, man. I mean, this was the time when on TV every night we had them fighting, the police fighting the youth in Soweto. It was the time when the Congressional Black Caucus was agitating for Reagan to pull the plug on his Southern African strategy and so on. And it was very clear to me that the Jamaicans, who had spent 150 years, perhaps, or getting on for that then, 150 years, waiting for the fruits of emancipation, that for them, the issue of black emancipation globally hinged on the South African struggle. There was no question about it. Their own emancipation depended on the outcome, and the idea that some white academic twit would wander into that while occupying a position in Jamaica was quite unimaginable. So I didn't go, of course. But later I wrote to James. I read everything that he'd written, and I was particularly interested by the fact that my own migration history overlapped with his, except that it was a very different time, different trajectory. But he started out in the Caribbean and went to Britain, and then to America, and then back to Britain, and then substantially to Africa and back to America, and so on. I had started out in Britain. I did research in West Africa. I then spent 10 years in the United States. I went back to Britain, and I came to Jamaica. And Jamaica was by far the most revelatory moment in my life. I mean, I trace everything that I've done in the last 25 years to the time that I was there, mainly because it allowed me to make sense of the relationship between Britain and Europe, Africa, North America, and the Caribbean, as I hadn't been able to before. And I was particularly interested in this aspect of James, and because it seemed to me when I was reading what he'd written that it was speaking very directly to me. And I also took up, as Aaron did, this whole question of what is old and what is new in society. And when I went from Britain to West Africa, to Ghana, it didn't seem very different to me. You know, I thought they were both old societies, fairly fixed in their ways. When I went to America, I spent 10 years there, and I just couldn't understand it. I mean, you know, it seemed to me that the Americans had made a break with their history in Europe of a kind that made it very difficult for me to understand. And so I had this idea, you know, that America was new, but I didn't understand it. Britain and Africa were old, and I found it reasonably easy to understand them. And then I came to Jamaica, and everything clicked. And I felt, and Aaron may want to dispute it, but I felt it was because the Caribbean was both old and new. I mean, the rupture with African and European society was not as great as it was in the United States. And yet at the same time, these people had been uprooted from their homes, and they had eradicated the indigenous population, as in the rest of the New World. So there was no question that it was new. And James, as Aaron said, repeatedly emphasized the modernity of the population formed by the Middle Passage, which is people who had made the break. And in the Black Jacobins, he goes out of his way to argue that these slaves who defeated the armies of all the leading powers of the day were also working in the most advanced industrial mode of production in the world, the sugar plantations of Saint-Domingue of Haiti in the 18th century. And so what he was arguing, and I think this is a theme of Aaron's talk, which I think is very controversial, certainly in the Caribbean and in African American studies more generally. He was claiming that the strength and revolutionary potential of the slaves came from their location in an advanced industrial mode of production. And to that extent, they were in the leading edge of Western civilization. But at the same time, that participation was modified by violent and extreme racial domination. So they were on the one hand part of Western civilization at its cutting edge, and at the same time subjected to the most terrible violent racism. And this came out in his work in the mid 20th century. I mean, he believed, and again I caught echoes of this in Aaron's talk, he believed that West Indians were special, West Indian intellectuals, he meant. People like him and Fanon and Aimé Césaire and others were able, he thought, to articulate the anti-colonial struggle most effectively because they were so thoroughly immersed in British and French civilization and education, and spoke these languages as their first language, whereas most Africans, of course, didn't. And so what he was arguing was that the anti-colonial revolution was fueled by the experience of racist imperialism combined with exposure to Western civilization. This was his line throughout, and Aaron gave us several examples of that. What I think is truly original about Aaron's lecture, and indeed his project, his attempt to take what has always been a problematic aspect of James's thought, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow, give you a chance to speak now. But his notion that Aaron's thesis that James's tortuous relationships with women as a black man of a certain colonial kind, and in the context of the growing women's movement and the development of black and white women's literature, that this, I mean, that I had never seen that particular quote, but when he said, well, it's not really possible to be a black man with that history and to embrace Western civilization and actually have a human relationship with a woman, which I think is an extraordinary conclusion. I think, as Aaron said, he was deeply confused in many of his reflections on gender, and I think as he got older, the quality of his thought, let's say, tapered off, and he became, I mean, it's not surprising that he spent his later years wondering how he messed up his relations with women so badly. But the fact is that his tremendous contribution to the history of Marxism, which he thought was epitomized in the book that came out of these Nevada letters that he wrote to his followers, Notes on Dialectics. He thought that that really was, and that was the first point that Aaron raised when he said, I think I have developed the thought of Marx and Lenin. He's referring to this book, Notes on Dialectics. I don't think Notes on Dialectics is as profound and lasting a contribution as the Black Jacobins, or Beyond the Boundary, or, in fact, however provisional it was originally, American Civilization. But I mean, James was a brilliant writer and critic, a historian, a revolutionary Marxist of extraordinary scope, and I'm very grateful to have been here tonight to hear Aaron's really quite original and wide-ranging take on some aspects of that achievement.
Thank you. The floor is open for anyone who'd like to jump in.
Come and sit here, Aaron.
Yeah. Anyone like to weigh in? Will. Let me just start. I mean, James wouldn't be the first with a first man with a revolutionary agenda to reveal this deep contradiction in his personal life. And yet, it seems as though from your presentation there's something different. You know, something I'm thinking in my mind, what is the difference? And I thought maybe it's that it's the word that you didn't come back to, but it's in the title. It's the idea of freedom. So it's as though that's what nags at them, as though the possibility of freedom has to have as one of its dimensions an intimate relationship with another. Of course, it's cast in terms of heterosexual relationship as being its kind of naturalized or highly formed. I don't know how he saw the intimate relations that were homosexual. But you could maybe speak to that. But the main point really is that in order to realize human freedom, and he writes a lot about the capacity of individuals to do that. That's part of what he takes from Marx's early manuscripts and so on. And yet it has to be realized in relation to another. But he doesn't seem to have fully worked out how that is to be, the relationship of intimacy. So I wonder if you could say something about where that thing, not just the gender thing, but about the relationship of intimacy, intimate relationality, and feeling how that winds its way through the story.
How are we doing it? Are we going to take a few and then respond, or?
Yeah, I think we're
Yeah, that's good. Or people can.
Or should we?
James gets his idea of civilization. And this, you can sort of imagine some of the Marxist stuff, but does he draw on an imperial archive of civilizationism, in which you have this hierarchy of civilizations? And I'm just interested in whether that factors at all in his thought.
I can say that he meant, Aeschylus, Dante, Shakespeare. I mean, for him, civilization was mainly a Western literary achievement.
Yeah, if I was to start with on that point, certainly, yeah, I mean, there is a way in which James, one way of thinking about James and civilization would be the fact that he was very enthralled by the Greece to the modern age story. Okay, we see it there and beyond the boundary. We see it in his essay "Every Cook Can Govern" about ancient Greek democracy. We have a very clear understanding that there is a particular narrative of Western civilization that he finds particularly compelling and he believes is the main story and the main game in town. I mean, in this essay, and this is probably one of the best places to go for that, called The Making of a Caribbean People. It's delivered at one of the Montreal Congresses of Black Writers. And this is 68, this is the time in which Walter Rodney has been kicked out of Jamaica. And there's a sense almost that James found himself under a bit of pressure by more radical black power figures who wanted to assert a particular type of Africanness more. And he comes up with this particular formulation towards the end of his essay, The Making of a Caribbean People. He says, I denounce European colonialist knowledge and historiography. However, it is a range of Western thinkers, and then he calls a whole slew of names, from Michelet to the Russian novelists to people like Césaire, etc. I forget all of the exact names, who have allowed me to understand the kind of person I am and why I can be here and speak to you about the making of the Caribbean people. And it's a quite extraordinary paragraph because he's very clear that there are a range of thinkers, from Shakespeare to European writers to African revolutionaries to contemporary Caribbean thinkers, which are all parts of his understanding of what Caribbean civilization is and what Western civilization is. So he feels no distance towards these figures, even though at the same time he's very clear that he denounces European colonial scholarship. I think another piece of the puzzle there in terms of understanding James and civilization would be, of course, what he actually thought of Africa. And it's fascinating that James never showed any kind of interest in the kind of civilizationalist Afrocentricity, or even to use the word Afrocentricity, because it immediately raises for people the study of Lefty Santa in political school in the 1980s. But I'm talking about the work from the late 19th century in African diaspora circles that was very much concerned with the legacy of ancient Egypt, the legacy of ancient Ethiopia, and that particular story about progress and achievement. James speaks about it a couple of times in his essay, The Destiny of the Negro, for example, an American essay in which he talks about it. But he's never particularly interested in this. And he's never interested in really Africa beyond the modern Africa. The modern Africa is the Africa he sees himself as engaging with. He's engaging with Nkrumah, he's engaging with Nyerere, he knows them, he's engaging with Kenyatta, he's working with them, he knows them, he's writing about them. But in terms of a pre-colonial Africa, he has very little interest in this. So civilization for James is, in the end, with certain caveats, forming pretty close to a Western narrative, despite the definitions that he's making within that Western narrative. On the question of freedom, I think that it's a really interesting question, Eric, in terms of how James sees human freedom and the quest for liberation, and why he has to keep returning to this question of his personal relations and the woman within that. Now, one of the reasons why I found James interesting in terms of thinking about gender was the fact that in his generation, I think there are very few Pan-African figures I can think about who talked about gender in terms of male figures of his generation, and even the generation after him. We have, for example, a generation earlier than James, Du Bois writing essays like The Damnation of Women. Okay? But when I think about many of the other major figures, I really can't think of this kind of concern and this kind of questioning, not just of self, but this questioning of women's role within the new society and human freedom. So that was one of the reasons why I was drawn to write about this in the first case, the fact that I kept seeing it appearing back and forth across his essays, and I was trying to figure out whether James had actually reached some kind of resolution. On the question of human freedom and the need for a relationship that has a particular sense of a particular sense of settlement, a particular sense of peace, a particular sense of coherence. I certainly think that we can see James in his later years yearning for this, but not really being quite sure about how this can come into being. But the question, of course, for most of us would be, how sure are many of us about how to bring this into being also? Okay, James's failure, of course, is part of our own failures, and that's one of the ways, and the fact that he tried so hard to push at it, and tried so hard to figure it out, writing, it was one of his central preoccupations in the last decade of his life, is, I think, important and is interesting. Yeah, and that was one of the reasons why I raised it as a question of thought. Yes.
Thank you. I found that very interesting and absorbing. Possibly it's because of your references to Bessie Head's work that I started thinking about whether or not James read Olive Schreiner or any writers in the South that were writing at the same time as she was, both novels and works of criticism like Women in Labour, which has a huge chunk in it on parasitism and also her understanding of the Caribbean as maybe a new kind of a place that South Africa could become like if only it weren't for the narcissism and extreme racism of Smuts and of other rulers. So I think that I wonder what kind of reading he was doing. Did he read Du Bois? You've told us about some of his other interlocutors and the people that have read him. But I just wonder, I've never ever thought about James in this light. And you are deeply knowledgeable about his library and the books that he read the world through. Did he engage with any of the works of people who were born in the South and who thought about the woman question rather than, say, the progressive era or maybe second wave feminists and then later African American and Caribbean womanists around him? I'd be really intrigued about that. And the reason I'd be really intrigued, and I'm not quite sure why Bessie Head popped up, obviously she's extremely interesting, but is there another reason? Is Bessie Head also in his mind at any time? Does he ever read her? And the reason I thought about all of this is because I'm interested in Thabo Mbeki's obsession with C.L.R. James. I've been to two huge conferences that were held in Durban, one in 2002 and one in 2004, both times when, as everybody here knows, Thabo Mbeki was already embroiled in his discredited take on the HIV debate. And they were both conferences on the African Renaissance, which he was chairing, and he was the plenary speaker both times. And both times he dug down into James's work, the first time on the Haitian Revolution and Black Jacobins, and the next time like a compendium of his work. And I've got like 3 or 4 notebooks filled with his speeches. One took, it was almost Buthelezi-like in length, it was nearly 2.5 hours, the length of the speech, and it was an absolute obsessional speech about C.L.R. James' view and how adopting his stance could free South Africa and create an African Renaissance here. And in his erudite and also narcissistic discussion, Thabo Mbeki references everyone from Bessie Head through a whole range of Caribbean and African American writers, and then goes back to Olive Schreiner as well. So I just wonder if you're interested in the close reading that Thabo Mbeki has made of this man that you have a close relationship
I have
with.
no idea of it whatsoever. Okay, and I'm not familiar with Olive Schreiner's
On the
work.
web, yeah, these conferences.
No, I mean, I don't know. I just thought that quote was it. The devil can quote scripture to his own purpose. Those lines. I mean, no, I'm fascinated, even though I'm very unaware. In terms of James and what James is reading, it's a little more tricky because I've been going to the James Archive, which is now at St. Augustine, the library, which is its own funny story in terms of what's happening with the James Archive at St. Augustine Library. This is in Trinidad, University of West Indies in Trinidad. But the link to Bessie Head was my own link, and it happened far more